unless I missed it, which is possible, I didn't hear your personal definition. Is there one that you would offer us? Like, how do you define racism?
Sure. So racism, I would define it as a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas.
Well, there you go, folks. From the horse's mouth himself. Racism is defined by a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequality that are substantiated by racist ideas. So this guy is like one of the premier scholars, if you want to call it, of this. He also describes himself as a historian who repeatedly refers to the succession crisis. Okay, the succession crisis. So, if it isn't obvious to all of you yet, and I think it is to most people, although I'm not sure if it was obvious to anyone in that crowd. If it was, none of them had the courage to ask. He's defining it by its own terms. Racism is racist things that do have racist results. Okay, so how do we determine what are racist policies and what are racist results? And the only kind of gem of a non-referential term there is equality. And if you watch this entire talk, which I will put a link to, it's clear that his definition of what is and is not racist is just equity, and apparently, in fact, quite explicitly, equality of outcome. Now, the logical leaps that he has to make to get that are just ridiculous, and I know there's a whole school of thought out there of people who, I think, to a very large extent correctly realize that the ideology here is intentionally garbled and mumbo-jumbo, right? These are descendants of Marx, and Marx infamously and quite purposely wrote in an obtuse, hard-to-understand manner that was so confusing that at some point Engels beseeched him to write more clearly because he would be forever accused of trying to bury the lead, so to speak, to hide his true intentions by misleading people. And although he did have a real point, Marx did have real beliefs, he did feel like for dialectical reasons, is the type of reasoning style that he had, which he inherited to a large extent from people like Hegel and Fichte. Not that they were Marxists themselves, they predated him, but they had a style that was similar to this. This is very popular in German philosophical circles in the mid-19th century, to have this dialectical reasoning that's just really hard to follow. And there's an argument, and I think a sound one, that these people are deliberately being obtuse and obscure and convoluted in their reasoning. On the other hand, it makes sense to deconstruct it anyway, just to show that it's completely and utterly erroneous. He's defining racism as racism. He's defining outcomes as racist, but the only thing that he doesn't refer to racism is equity. And so he says if you look at anything, if there's a difference between outcomes for blacks and whites, those are the examples he always uses. He never uses, at least in this video, maybe he has in others, other races that are outcomes. He goes, that is by definition a result of a racist policy. And I think that that's just, okay, so by that definition, let's say the majority of black people live in the South, and the South is hit by a hurricane. Therefore, the majority of black people, a disproportional majority of black people, suffer from hurricanes. Therefore, that is a result of racist policies. Racist policies caused black people to suffer disproportionately because of a hurricane, right? He has a false dichotomy in here where he basically says if there's a disparity in outcomes, that is prima facie evidence that there is a racist policy behind it. No, there are other things that cause it. There are things that aren't even policy at all. Now, of course, the shibboleth that they don't want to touch is biology, and I'm not opposed to touching that shibboleth of talking about biology, but one does not even need to do that, right? Thomas Sowell never does that. You never even have to fall back on that, which again, not to deny there might be some validity there. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Completely doesn't even matter to the point, though. Like, there are probably an inconceivable number of things that are not policies, right? What is the policy that made black people suffer from hurricanes or live more in urban centers, or any number of other possible problems, right? And he's just what we have here is kind of a formulation of racism equals blah 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 equals equality, So there's a conflation or equivocation between racism and not just equality, but explicit egalitarianism in terms of end result. End result, egalitarianism, the most brutal kind that there is. I mean, there's more than one type of egalitarianism. You have egalitarianism before the law, something that I think has a lot of benefits. It makes a lot of sense. And you have egalitarianism of opportunity, which is what a lot of people in the United States hope. We all go to the same public school. We all have the same rights, and therefore we have all the same opportunities. Serious questions as to whether society could ever do that or not, and the answer is obviously no, it can't, without becoming incredibly totalitarian and imposing all kinds of costs associated with that. But then the worst of all is egalitarianism or equality of outcome. There's too many variables. We can get into a whole nature-nurture debate, but we don't have to, because unless both nature and both nurture are completely equal in every way, you are not going to have the same outcomes. And even if they were, you won't have the same outcomes because of chance, right? You could have a population where everyone is exactly the same and has exactly the same upbringing. It's at least theoretically possible, or at least hypothetically a thought experiment you can write. It's not practically possible or even remotely possible. But as the character in Gattaca says, there is no gene for fate, right? You can be a genius and have a great upbringing, but you could still accidentally get hit by a car and break your back and be paralyzed, right? So you could have all these things and you still wouldn't be equal. And of course, we can't have all those things. You can't have perfect equality. It's impossible. And to strive for that is to destroy everything and achieve nothing, right? You're going to destroy the world. It's not a question of perfection. The costs that you would need to impose, the tyranny, the opportunity costs that you would need to impose to try and reach that are astronomical. It's far worse than the most outlandish, exaggerated, hyperbolic description of slavery that ever existed. And slavery was horrible because slavery was everywhere, right? And here's the other thing. This is very, very selective. This outrage that they have, this deconstruction, this formulation of racism. This could just as easily be used to condemn all the labor unions, the government, the federal government, the state governments, right? Not just the policies they don't like, not just the institutions they don't like, every institution everywhere throughout all of history. But they don't use it that way, because at the end of the day, he'll say that an anti-racist policy is universal health care. Well, how is that anti-racist? Is that, if we have universal health care, does that mean that we're going to have equal results? No, it doesn't. We're not going to have equal outcomes if we have universal health care. So it will still be, by his definition, racist, right? But he just wants those policies, and so this is transparently, at least apparently, maybe he believes this, I don't know, I can't see into his mind, just a tactic. And this kind of, like if I was in 7th grade and I made an argument where I defined something by referring to that same thing twice, and with no reference to anything else that provides any substance or detail of the definition, I would fail. The teacher would point that out in a second. And this guy talks about he struggles academically. Like, yeah, I'm sure he did struggle academically, but not for the reasons that he thinks, right? The fact that, is everyone in this room stupid? I'm going to assume there's enough people here that they're not all stupid, but the ones who aren't clearly feel like they can't ask. Or maybe they tried and they were edited. I don't know. There's no editing in the video that I can really see, but maybe they just gave a stern look not to ask. But this, and it's funny too, he talks about in another part, and I'll put a link so you all can watch this whole thing. It's worth watching these people in their full context and reading their books on top of that, which I'll be doing in the near future. I'm doing right now, actually. But he talks about not berating your crazy uncle for being racist until you give him a definition of racism. But yet that's all he does all day. Berates everything, not every person, every institution, right? And it's not like every outcome in our society is from a policy. That's the other thing. I mean, this gives a lot of undue credit to the state. Look, and I'm an anarchist. The influence that the state has on society is enormous. It's pernicious, and it's all over the place. But it's not everything. All right, it's not omniscient and it's not omnipotent. It's not everywhere at all times and all things. There are things in society. There are major trends in society that are not the fault or the result of the government. In fact, there are things that happen in direct contradiction or in spite of the government, and then many other things that don't have anything to do with it, right? So to just assume, well, everything that happens, it must be a policy. No. wrong. That policy must be racist. No, wrong. And that anything that's not equal must be racist. As if that literally means it excludes all other potential explanations for a difference. There's no possible thing that could describe a difference between, I guess, two groups or even two people than the fact of racism. It's the explanation for everything. And how do we know that? Well, we just assume this. It's the same problem with White Fragility by D'Angelo. You just assume racism and then you find it everywhere. It's not a question of, she even says this, it's not a question of did racism take place? It's a question of how did racism manifest? It's automatic, we assume, and then we find it. And then they'll say, well, there's racism everywhere. Oh my God, how? Well, we're just assuming there's. Okay, well, there's magical elves everywhere, and magical elves cause all the inequality. And magical elves are the reason that there's disparities between the number of black people who commit murder and the number of white people who commit murder. And there's magical elves that make a difference in the IQ, and there's magical elves that make all the differences in the world. And you know that because inequality is by definition the result of magical elves interfering in our society. And if that sounds fucking stupid to you, that's because it is. Anyway, short one today, guys. I hope you're all doing very well, and have a great weekend. Ciao.